All right, so tonight we're still in the High Middle Ages, that period 1000 to 1300. And tonight we're going to talk about Western Christianity's relationship with three groups who were other in the Middle Ages. So we're going to talk about Western Christianity's relationship with Eastern Christianity, and we're going to talk about their relationship with Islam and their relationship with Judaism. And some of the material tonight is difficult material. And really, we just need to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus through some of this. So we're going to start with the interaction that the Western Church had with the Eastern Church. So in the earliest church, the center of gravity was in Jerusalem, but after the center moved away from Jerusalem, there were centers of leadership, of Christian leadership, all around the Mediterranean basin, in Antioch and Alexandria and Carthage. But then around the time of Constantine, you remember the Roman Emperor Constantine, who made Christianity legal and supported Christianity, he also built a capital city in he called it Constantinople. He built it where a city had been that was called Byzantium. So you can see that on the map here. So we've got Rome in the west and Constantinople here in the east. And he wanted to make this a great capital, and obviously he named it after himself. So two things are happening now. So the Western Church, part of the Roman Empire, is getting strong because of this new patronage from the emperor and, donation of churches and money and all that. And Constantinople is also growing and becoming a powerful place of Christian leadership. Both these things are happening. So these two groups of Christian leaders in these two cities, Rome and Constantinople, started to vie for the upper hand in terms of overall church leadership. And a number of things began to separate the East and the West. One of them was language, actually. So in the early church, the language of Christianity was Greek. As the Western Roman Empire became more powerful and strong, they started to speak more and more Latin, and that became the language of the church there. And so the global church is now really speaking two different languages, and never underestimate the power of language differences to separate people. So this is one of the things that's happening. Another thing that's happening is a big controversy over icons. So this is an example of a typical style of painting of icons. And I'm sure that most or all of you have seen a painting that looks like this. This is a specific style. The church in the Eastern part of Christianity venerated icons, which means that they just looked at them to get themselves sort of in this state of reverence and honor for whoever the picture was of the Jesus or the saints or whatever. Now, a controversy arose, and it's very complicated, but I'm just going to tell you the basics. And in the West, in Rome, they said, no, that's not right, don't do that. And Constantinople in the East, they said, yes, this is proper and right, so we're going to do this. So there's a big controversy over this. Another big controversy was that the Western Church, the Latin Church, headquartered in Rome, added a phrase to the Nicene Creed. So, and it had to do with the Holy Spirit. So before, the original Nicene Creed said, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord and giver of life, who proceeds from the Father. And Rome added, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord and giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son. And that filioque is Latin for and the Son. So they added this, and I can understand the Eastern Church getting upset and angry because the Nicene Creed, the original Nicene Creed, was written by a whole church council. And the Western Church then took it upon themselves to add something without having a church council. They just did it unilaterally. So the veneration of icons and this thing that they did with the Nicene Creed, those were two huge points of contention between the East and the Western Church. And there were several other smaller things going on, but those were the big two. And much of this was going on during the early Middle Ages period that we left previously. But it came to a head in 1054, which is right as we move into the High Middle Ages that we've been diving into. And what happened in 1054 was something called the Great Schism. So leadership in the East and the West tried to assert authority over the other. And then in 1054, each side excommunicated the other. And we're going to see something later this evening when we get into the Crusades that made things even more bitter between the two branches when we get into the Fourth Crusade. And this schism still exists. There have been attempts at reconciliation, and those attempts have increased, but an official reconciliation of the Eastern Orthodox Church and Roman Catholicism still has not ever happened. All right, so we're gonna have to go back to the early Middle Ages, to the beginning of the early Middle Ages, back to the 600s to understand the roots of the Crusades. So in that time period in the 600s, something unexpected happened. And out of Arabia, there's this forgotten corner of the world that had been generally ignored by the Romans and the Persian Empire. Out of Arabia came this tidal wave of conquest that threatened to engulf the world. And in a few years, the Persian Empire had vanished, and many of the ancient Roman territories were in Arab hands. So I want to outline the beginnings and expansion of Islam to set the context for the Crusades. So again, we're going to go back to the beginning of the early Middle Ages. Muhammad, who was the founder of Islam, was born in 570, so way back to the beginning of the early Middle Ages. He was born in Arabia. His parents both died before he was 6 years old, and he was raised by an uncle who was the head of a prominent clan in the city of Mecca in Arabia. And at this time, there were thriving trade routes from Mecca, from Arabia, north up into Syria, east to India, west to North Africa, lots of trade going on. And Muhammad traveled with his uncle, who was a merchant. He traveled on these trade routes with him, on these trading journeys. And he likely learned about Christianity and Judaism along those trade routes. But he didn't appear to understand the orthodoxies of either religion. So in other words, the generally accepted beliefs of either religion. And then according to Muslim tradition, in 610 and 620, he had visions of the angel Gabriel calling him to be the prophet of God, the one God. And he lived in a very polytheistic culture. The Arabs were incredibly polytheistic. But he had a vision of being called to be the prophet of one God, a monotheistic God in this polytheistic culture. And the people that he lived with in Mecca rejected his ideas because of their intense polytheism. And they persecuted him. And so much that he fled from Mecca to Medina. And this is a modern map. This is modern geography on this map. But Mecca and Medina are still there as they were back in the early Middle Ages. So you see, Mecca is where he came from, and when he was persecuted, he fled to Medina. Mm-hmm. So That was in 622 that he fled to Medina. And then for 8 years, he gathered followers and he had this growing cohort. And for 8 years, he battled his enemies in Mecca. And finally, in 630, so after 8 years of this fighting, he conquered his enemies in Mecca, and he took control of Mecca, and he demolished all of the idols. Okay. Medina continued to be his home base. And from there, he launched a major military campaign into Syria, which you can't see on this map, but it's to the north here, north of Jordan and Jerusalem. So he went on a major military campaign. And along the way, he arranged treaties with Christians, peace treaties, so to speak. And then in 632, he died. So Muhammad garbled the gospel, but whatever mistakes he made, his ideology is largely framed in terms of Jewish and Christian concepts and practices. Although later portions of the Quran, which is their holy book, later portions of the Quran had a strong polemic or a strong attack in them against both Jews and Christians. But while Muhammad was alive, he generally kept a positive attitude towards Christians in general. He decreed that Christians were to receive protection, and also Jews, although he was less tolerant of Jews. And for Arabs, for his fellow Arabs who were pagans, polytheistic pagans, they faced a much harsher reality under Muhammad. They were forced to either convert or die. Unfortunately, Muhammad's military campaigns against his fellow Arabs, his massacre of a Jewish tribe at one point because they didn't, I don't remember the whole story, but he massacred a whole group of Jewish people because they didn't obey him in something. And also his raid into Syria, all these sort of military things set an ideological groundwork for Muslim persecution of Christians. And this polemic, this strong attack of the Quran, provided a theological justification for jihad against Christians. And the Muslim empire expanded by force of arms as far as west to Spain, north to Constantinople, and east to the farthest corners of Asia. Now, Muslims today internally debate whether Allah would approve of all the steps his followers have taken along Muhammad's path. And I just wanted to share with you, just really briefly here, the 5 pillars of Islam. Because I want to present this story as very nuanced and complex. So Islam is based on these 5 pillars. The confession of faith, which is there is no God, but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger or prophet. Prayer, all Muslims are to pray 5 times a day facing Mecca. Tithing, or almsgiving, they're supposed to give 2.5% of their total wealth to the poor and needy. Fasting, during the holy month of Ramadan, they abstain from food, water, sex, from dawn till sunset. And just as a point of interest, Ramadan this year is April 12th to May 12th. And then the last pillar is pilgrimage, where, if possible, at least once in your lifetime, Muslims are expected to try to travel to Mecca, to take a pilgrimage to Mecca for rituals of worship and prayer at the central shrine in Mecca, which is Islam's holiest city. Now, in the territories where the successors of Muhammad conquered, Christians outnumbered Muslims. There was one leader of Islam after Muhammad died, who didn't live very long. He didn't have any impact. But the next ruler of Islam was a man by the name of Umar, and he didn't kill or force Christians to convert. However, he charged them higher taxes wherever they conquered. The Christians, remember, they were the majority, but their Muslim rulers charged them higher taxes and named them protected persons, but that actually meant a status of a second or third class citizen. They couldn't build new places of worship. They couldn't repair their old places of worship. They weren't allowed to evangelize. Muslim men could marry Christian women or Jewish women and raise their children as Muslims, but Christian men could only marry their own kind. And Christian men were not allowed to serve in the military and benefit from the rich pay bonuses and plunder that you would get for being in the military. So Christians held on to their faith under this early Muslim rule, despite obvious incentives to convert, if you wanted to be one of the first class citizens. But Christians held out. But eventually, over some generations, the resistance died out, and in all but a few pockets, Islam won the regions. A couple of examples of resistance that remain today are the Coptic Christians in Muslim Egypt, and who have actually been persecuted by Islam to greater or lesser degrees for centuries. I don't know if you remember in 2015, the video that appeared of 21 Coptic men they were in some sort of orange jumpsuits, and they were beheaded on the beach by radical Muslims. They were Coptic Christians. And also in Ethiopia, Ethiopia was one of the very first places where there was Christianity in Africa, in the world. And they still have a pocket of Christianity in Muslim Ethiopia. I do want to mention that Christians stopped the Muslim military advance into their territory in 732 at the Battle of Tours, which is in France. This orange here on the map is all Islam, Muslim territory, and they were aggressively trying to expand, but they were stopped in France at the Battle of Tours. And the leader of the Frankish army was Charles, who was the grandfather of Charlemagne. And he led a Frankish army against this big Muslim raiding party and defeated them. And they stopped there. Islam didn't come any further north from there into Europe. And Charlemagne's grandfather, became known as the Hammer. In French, Charles Martel. So back to Umar. So Umar conquered Jerusalem in 638 and did what I said that he did, where he set up disincentives for being Christians, but he didn't physically persecute. And for 400 years, Christian pilgrims were allowed to peacefully go into Jerusalem on pilgrimage. And pilgrimage to the Holy Land was a hugely important thing to Christians back then. Even the Emperor Constantine's mother went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So, and that was back in the 300s. So pilgrimage was a hugely important part of Christian spirituality back then. And we have this kind of status quo. And for 400 years, pilgrims are still going to the Holy Lands, still, crossing Europe and going on pilgrimage. But out of nowhere, we have this new kind of threat emerging in 1055. And again, it's like the original. This is kind of like out of nowhere. And it's coming from the steppes of Central Asia. Some pagan nomads came down conquering, and these were the Seljuk Turks. And bizarrely, while they were conquering the Arabs and the Arab Muslims, they themselves converted to Islam. So now we have Muslim Arab overlords replaced by harsher, coarser Muslim Turks. And the Muslim Seljuk Turks captured Jerusalem in 1071. And they drove out the Christian priests, and they were not tolerant like the Arab Muslims had been. And the Eastern Orthodox Church, so here you can see, here's where they're, in this circle I do here, there's where the Seljuk Turks are originating from, and they're coming down and they're conquering. And Constantinople is the headquarters, so to speak, of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And they sent a message to Rome asking for help because this new threat was so strong and getting so close. And the big thing that happened now was it became impossible for pilgrimage to the Holy Land. It was too dangerous. It just wasn't allowed anymore. And this was happening in the 11th century, which is the time we talked about last week with this intense Christian devotion on the part of lay people. That all this renewal and revival that was happening in the 11th century, and it was just, and pilgrimage was just, like I said, such a key part of that. And now all of a sudden they can't go on pilgrimage. And Western Christianity began to be nervous about how far these Muslim Turks were going to push into Western Europe. And Europe had kind of begun to think of itself as some kind of unified entity. So these are some of the contributing factors to the Crusades. It's a very complex scenario, but I'm trying to give you enough to try to understand the basics of what is going on here in this short amount of time that we have. So no pilgrimage, and just this fear of these savage Muslim Turks. So in 1095, the Pope at that time, by the name of Urban II, traveled to France. So he went to the land of the Franks, where Charlemagne had ruled. And this was the place in the 11th century, which was the biggest place for the whole concept of knights, knights and shining armor and chivalry and all that stuff. That France was the biggest place where that was happening. So the Pope went there to France, and he preached a sermon, and he preached that Christians shouldn't stand by while Muslims conquer Christian territories. And they shouldn't stand by as Muslims take over the sanctuaries and shrines of the Christian faith, even the holy places themselves in Jerusalem. And with his sermon, he appeals to both their Christian conscience and their military prowess. Remember, this is the land of Charles the Hammer and Charlemagne and, all these valiant knights. So he said, as part of his sermon, he said, "On whom, therefore, is the task of avenging these wrongs and of recovering these territories incumbent, if not on you? You who above other nations, God has conferred remarkable glory in arms, courage, bodily energy, and strength to humble the hairy scalp of those who resist you." So the Pope called the Franks, these Frankish knights, the people of God who have been chosen as divine agents against the forces of evil. And he's talking and he's preaching to knights. And as he preaches, a movement verging on hysteria sweeps through the crowd of assembled knights, and they all start crying out, "God wills it! God wills it!" And they start tearing up clothes and tearing up cloth and making them into the shape of a cross, putting it on their clothes, sort of symbolizing their resolve to go and rescue the Holy Land. And the word crusade comes from the Latin word crux, which means cross. So we see in the subsequent months, we see knights and even ordinary people in much of France and the Rhineland, which is Western Germany. We see them roused to this feverish call, this call to arms against the enemies of Christendom. Now, remember, this was a while back, but maybe you remember Charlemagne's letter to Pope Leo, the Pope who crowned him Holy Roman Emperor, the first Holy Roman Emperor. Charlemagne wrote to Pope Leo about the role of kings and their armies and the role of church, the church. And remember, he said, "It is our part, the kings and the armies, it is our part with the help of divine holiness to defend by arms strength the Holy Church of Christ everywhere from the onslaughts of the pagans and the ravages of infidels, and to strengthen within the knowledge of the Catholic faith." That is the part of kings. So 4 years after Urban's sermon, the First Crusade retakes Jerusalem. Crusade number 1. This was in 1099. The Crusaders stormed Jerusalem, and they mercilessly sacked the city and pretty much killing nearly everyone. And I want you to know that in 1187, when the Muslims under Saladin took Jerusalem back, they allowed the captives to go free. But that accords with medieval laws of war, which say that if a city surrenders, you don't sack it, and if it resists, you do. And Jerusalem resisted in 1099 when the Crusaders went in, and so it was sacked. And when it surrendered in 1187, it was not sacked. But in actuality, see, it's so complex and so nuanced, but in actuality, there was cruelty and brutality on both sides in the Crusades. And I want to talk about this idea of holy violence. So for the idea of holy violence, we can look at Augustine back from the 400s. Remember Augustine? He just never goes away. Like I said, he has something to say about everything. He formulated this theory of a just war, called just war theory. And he, and all through the medieval world, they concluded that violence is morally neutral, and it may or may not be evil, depending on the intention of the perpetrator. And this was the normative Christian view. And we have to remember that this is not normative for us. It hasn't been normative since the 16th or 17th centuries. But it was normative back then that violence was neutral. It depended on the intentions of who was perpetrating the violence. And we always need to take seriously the religious motivations of the participants, especially in the early Crusades. And just to note, there were literally hundreds of crusades over a period of over 200 years. In some periods, armed expeditions, armed crusades set forth almost every year. There were 8 major named crusades, but there were literally hundreds of small ones every year. Every year ones were going out. And through this journey to the sacred center of the world, Jerusalem, the Holy Land, what these armed pilgrims were understood to be doing, and it's hard for us to get our minds around this, but they were understood to be reinforcing the unity of Christendom on earth and in heaven by enacting the central ritual of the Christian life, the redemptive self-sacrifice. So we have a really hard time getting ourselves into the mind of a medieval knight who understood that this was a just war. Okay, so again, there were 8 major crusades, but only the first one was a military success. The one where they retook Jerusalem from the Muslims. Only that. But like I said, the Muslims retook Jerusalem in 1187 after 88 years in Christian hands. Saladin and his forces took it back. Just a couple of other notes here. So the Third Crusade was to take Jerusalem back from Saladin. And this is Richard the Lionhearted. And this is the crusade that you probably have seen in the movies with Richard the Lionhearted and, Robin Hood and all that time period. Richard the Lionhearted was a military ruler from England that joined in a crusade. They didn't succeed in taking Jerusalem back then. By the Fourth Crusade, we see things spiraling out of control and becoming more linked to economic expansion and profiteering. And it gets harder and harder for the Pope to give any kind of spiritual backing to them. For instance, in the Fourth Crusade, in 1198 to 1204, the Crusaders left in ships from Venice. So they hired Venetian sailors to bring them across over to Constantinople. And again, Constantinople, this is the capital of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And these Crusaders and their Venetian sailors sacked Constantinople. It had nothing to do with anything but plundering. And that, as you can imagine, kind of soured the relationship between Rome and Constantinople, and put an end to any hope of reconciliation back then. We also have, in 1212, 2 children's crusades. They both happened in the same year. In one of them, a 10-year-old boy named Nicholas preached a children's crusade in Cologne, Germany. And supposedly he recruited 20,000 children. They marched off on crusade, but when they reached Italy, the girls were pretty much taken and put into brothels, and the boys were sold as slaves. And the same year, in France, a 12-year-old boy named Stephen was said to have gathered 30,000 children. And again, they fell into the hands of evil people and they were sold as slaves. And these were deeply disturbing and seemed to have disturbed the conscience of the masses, as they rightly should have. Well, finally, in 1291, Crusader forces are defeated at Acre, which is this location here in the Holy Land, north of Jerusalem. Crusader forces were defeated there, and the Christians are expelled from the Holy Land completely. And Christians as a political force in the Holy Land ended in 1291 and never returned since. But just to round out the story of the medieval story of Christian and Muslim interaction, by the 1300s, so the Crusades are over now, it's 1300s, we have a new Muslim force appearing in Asia Minor, the Ottoman Turks. And these, again, they came out of Central Asia. They came down like the Seljuk Turks. These were just a different tribe of Turks, the Ottoman Turks. The Christian Balkans fell to them, which is all this sort of dark green here. That all fell to the Ottoman Turks. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks sacked Constantinople. And this was the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. Remember, I said when the Western Roman Empire fell, the Eastern was going to last another 1,000 years. Well, this is now the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. And in Constantinople was this magnificent church called the Hagia Sophia, this is great Eastern Orthodox church that the Muslims turned into a mosque in 1453. Just going just a couple centuries ahead here, in 1683, the Ottomans launched their final attack on Europe. They kept moving into Europe. Their final attempt was their second attempt to conquer Vienna. And they were defeated. Their second attempt, they were defeated. And the Muslims made no more serious attempts to take that city or any city in Europe after that. And the Muslims kind of, at this point, near the end of the 17th century, they kind of slipped into a long period of decline. And they would stay that way until they would only emerge from that decline in the 20th century. So what should we think about the Crusades? So firstly, historians try to understand what people did and why they did it. So why did medieval Christians risk their lives and sacrifice nearly all they owned to crusade? Because crusades were expensive. Many people went broke going on crusade. Given the historical setting and their understanding, which I've tried to explain at least to a small extent, given the historical setting and their understanding, were these people trying to express love of God through crusading? And although I certainly can't condone everything that happened by any means, I have to think that many of them were. Many of them understood themselves to be expressing love for God and crusading, clearly accepting those who were explicitly out for economic gain, like those who sacked Constantinople. And I need to remember that Christianity was under near constant pressure from the Islamic world from the 7th century to the 17th century. So this is not a simple, uncomplicated story. So I want to mention two outcomes of the Crusades. There were lots of outcomes. I just want to mention two of them, one negative, or one positive and one negative. So first of all, the knights who came back from the Crusades, many of them were culturally changed, because in this travel that they were doing, they expanded their experience through contact with other cultures, and in a positive way. So many of them came back having read Aristotle and other ancient literature. And remember, in our very first class, I talked about how big of an influence Aristotle was in the Roman Empire. Well, during the Germanic upheavals and the conquering by these tribes and all that stuff in the fall of the Western Roman Empire, all that stuff was lost. It was all just, things were burned and things were lost. And the Crusaders brought a lot of this ancient learning back with them. And the Crusades were responsible for recovery of scholarship in the West and opening up access to this and this ancient Eastern learning, and a real fascination with it. In many ways, the cultural sophistication of the East was far greater than the West, because they hadn't endured that all that beating by the barbarian Germanic tribes. So the Crusaders came back with a longing for learning, and we're going to see a major intellectual tradition rise in Europe as the Crusades wind down. We're going to look at that next week. A negative aspect of the Crusades was that the use of this crusading ideal as a force that could be turned not only against the enemy without, but also against the enemy within. And we see a growing fear of the outsider in Western Christianity, of the outsider, of fear of the Jew, fear of people who are considered heretics. And I want to spend our last part of this class looking at the Christian-Jew interaction in this time. And there is here in this, for me at least, no ambiguity, none of the ambiguity of the Crusades and the Christian-Muslim interaction. For me, the Christians just got this wrong. in regards to the Jews and their attitudes towards Jews and persecution of Jews. One of the groups during the time of the First Crusade was an unauthorized band of peasants who went on crusade under the charismatic leadership of a guy named Peter the Hermit. And this band of peasant crusaders, they weren't all armed like the knights were. They went off. They were all eventually killed by the Muslims, but on the way there, they killed and massacred Jews on their march to the Holy Land. And this, let me just stop sharing here and just talk to you for a few minutes here. So this anti-Semitism didn't start with the Crusades by any means. It didn't end there either. And Jew hating wasn't a Christian invention. So it extends back even before Christianity. We have records in Egypt and in Greek and Roman writings of massacres of Jews and anti-Semitism. But after the time of Jesus, after Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension to the Father, the Jews that lived in Jerusalem and Palestine under Roman rule, Roman oppression, they kept fighting wars against their Roman rulers. And they carried on with this fighting against their Roman rulers for 100 years. And Rome kept hitting back harder and harder until finally, in about 136, so way before, way back, the Emperor Hadrian demolished them. And Christians at that time felt like they had a reason to kind of, sort of separate themselves from Jews and not call any attention to any relationship that they might have had with Jews, to distance themselves. And this kept on. And there are a couple of writers that I specifically want to mention in the 300s and 400s in the early church that contributed to this divide. So we have Chrysostom. He was a preacher, a bishop in Antioch, and he believed in this interpretation of Paul's letters where the Christians were not supposed to be partaking of Jewish rituals and circumcision and all that they didn't have to become Jews before they could become Christians. And Chrysostom noticed Christians in Antioch partaking in some Jewish festivals and rituals and feasts, which made him nervous. So he preached a series of sermons to stop this, but he got a little carried away in this sermon series entitled Against the Jews. And he preached that God had forsaken the synagogue and allowed it to be turned over to demon worship. And he no doubt was using rhetorical exaggeration to make a point, but it makes you wonder what happened to the mandate of Christ to love everyone. Anyways, the Nazis reprinted and distributed Chrysostom's sermons in that sermon series against the Jews. They distributed those throughout Germany and Austria to fuel this anti-Semitic hatred. And when I read that, I said to myself, who gave the Nazis those sermons? Like, who put those sermons in the Nazis' hands? The other person I want to mention, once again, is Augustine, living around the same time. What he had to say about this Jewish question was he taught the principles for Jewish life in a Christian empire. He said Jews could not rule or have exercise any authority over Christians, but neither were they to be killed or abused. He thought of Jews as like a teaching prop, like an object lesson, a teaching lesson about the triumph of Christianity. He said the Jews in their state, their miserable state, were a witness to the truth, that their miserable state in the presence offered a true sign of their failure to recognize Jesus and a punishment for their complicity in Jesus' death. This is Augustine. So we fast forward to the Middle Ages. Oh yeah, I'm not sharing my screen here. Okay, we fast forward to the Middle Ages, and we see this crusading ideal turned inward, and the presence of any dissenters or unbaptized outsiders becoming more and more unacceptable. We already mentioned 1096, that peasants' crusade that slaughtered Jews on their way to the Holy Land. In 1190, there was a massacre of Jews in York, England. And we get to the end of the High Middle Ages in the 13th century and the 1200s. We see great efforts to convert Jews. There was forcing them, they forced the Jews to listen to sermons, and they forced them to debate errors in the Talmud. And the Talmud is one of their holy books. So they forced the Jews to debate with Christian scholars over errors in the Talmud, and they burned copies of the Talmud. And the attitudes of rulers all over Europe was becoming increasingly hostile. And by 1200, a clear physical stereotype had emerged. So we have male Jews who have pointed hats, denoting some kind of Eastern foreignness. They have a crooked nose in these stereotypes. They're swarthy to make them look ugly. And they have either a foolish or a conniving expression on their face to make them look like to show that they lack true reason and spirit. In 1290, all the Jews were expelled from England. And by 1400, 1500, all of the main cities of the Holy Roman Empire, all the cities had expelled the Jews out of them into small towns and villages. And narratives grew of something called blood libel, which meant that the Jews were accused of using Christian blood in their rituals, especially the blood of Christian children, and that the Jews desecrated the consecrated Eucharist bread. Now, not every Christian believed these narratives, but enough of them did to shape opinion. And even Martin Luther, when we get to the Reformation, Martin Luther, near the end of his life, his reforming life, he wrote something called On the Jews and Their Lies. And he incited hatred and violence against the Jews, even when both his enemies and his friends told him to stop. Now, Luther was aged when he wrote that and cantankerous, and who knows, maybe he was going senile for all we know, but those writings exist from Luther, and they were going to prove to be a treacherous foundation for theories that humankind consisted of inferior Semites and superior Aryans. And the Nazis would call Luther a genuine German who hated non-Nordic races. And we already know a fair amount of history of the ghastly anti-Semitic 20th century and the anti-Semitism in America. And I don't know the 2020 stats, but for 2019, anti-Semitic hate crimes reached record levels in America. In the 20th century, at a Roman Catholic Church Council, which was called Vatican II in the 1960s, the Catholic Church released a formal statement repudiating anti-Semitism. A little late, but they did that. And Jews and Christians found some arenas of political cooperation. This is a picture of Martin Luther King Jr. and Abraham Heschel, who was a rabbi and a Jewish theologian, and they were friends. And here in this picture, they're protesting the Vietnam War together. But the damage done by Christians and Christianity to Jews and Judaism has been deep and prolonged. And we need to not try to defend ourselves, but learn the truth, the history, listen respectfully, try to understand the pain, become aware of Christian speech that hurts Jews, it hurts Judaism, and get rid of any patronizing and condescending caricatures that have been a part of Christian discourse for endless centuries. These have been very challenging topics for me to study and prepare and teach this week. And most likely for some of it for you to hear. And like I said in the beginning, We need to keep our eyes on Jesus, who is faithful to preserve his beloved bride, the church, even when she is unfaithful to his call to love everyone.